Thank you all for joining us for today's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual and live events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on our social media channels via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. But today, we are thrilled to welcome Eve Fairbanks in conversation with Kiese Laymon, talking about Eve's debut, The Inheritors. Eve Fairbanks is a former political writer for the New Republic. Her essays and reportage have been published in the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Guardian, and many other outlets. A dozen years in the making, The Inheritors weaves together the stories of three ordinary South Africans over 5 tumultuous decades in a sweeping and exquisite look at what really happens when a country resolves to end white supremacy. In 1994, the world's last explicit racial segregationist regime collapsed to make way for something unprecedented. Through the lives of Dipuo, her daughter Malaika, and Christo, one of the last white South Africans drafted to fight for the apartheid regime, award-winning journalist Eve Fairbanks probes what happens when people once locked up into certain kinds of power relations find their status shifting. Observing the subtle truths about race and power that extend well beyond the national borders, she explores the questions that preoccupy so many of us today. How can we let go of our pasts as individuals and as countries? How should the historical debts be paid? And how can a person live on an honorable life in society that, for better or worse, they no longer recognize? Fairbanks will be joined in conversation by Kiese Laymon, the author of the genre-bending novel Long Division, the essay collection How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, and the memoir Heavy, which won the 2019 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction and was named one of the 50 best memoirs of the past 50 years by the New York Times. Today's event will include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone else has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please press the thumbs up button. Also, please support Eve and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her book from us. A link to buy The Inheritors will be shared in the chat a couple of times during the event, along with a link to Kiese's books as well. Eve and Kiese, thank you so much for joining us today for this event.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And I'm especially so excited to chat with Kiese. I was totally thrilled. I gave Kiese a copy of the manuscript sometime last year, and I was so excited that that you enjoyed it, that you found it interesting, because I love your work. I love your writing. I love your style. I've said that to you a couple of times, but I also love the way that you describe the South, which is where you're from.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, as I grew up in Virginia, Northern Virginia. My father's family comes from Georgia, and there was something that was, I don't know, really reminiscent of the way that I remember growing up in what you wrote, which is this sense of kind of living on, like, I don't know, in these empty halls that had been built super, super long ago, and we're starting to, trying to be changed, also kind of falling apart, but also kind of resolutely sort of staying, and then had like new stuff kind of growing in them. There's this kind of sense of being in the litter of the past, and a litter of mistakes that were made, sins that were committed, deep, irrevocable sins that were committed in the past, but also kind of a richness to that. And I hope that there's something kind of similar. I think my book's really different from stuff that you write, but to the book that I've written on South Africa. So I'm just going to speak briefly about it, and then we're going to kind of go at it. But oh no. I'm standing with a friend, and it's seen a squirrel here. All right, it's gone off to deal with this one. Yeah, so I was a political writer for the New Republic in DC, covering all your stuff. Congress, congressional sessions, the Bush administration, and the 2008 political campaign. And then I kind of like took a turn, and I moved basically on a one-way ticket. I had a writing grant, but kind of moved just by myself to South Africa. And I honestly, like, some of my reasons for going were kind of push reasons, wanting to get away from some of the way, we can talk about later, but politics in particular is covered in the US, covered in DC, really focusing on elite top players and not the people necessarily who are living it, and wanted to be taught by another place and be shaped by another place. But I'd read really what was possible to read about South Africa, that one can kind of get in the US. This was in 2009. Just the kind of big history books, even post-apartheid books. And I was still kind of so unprepared for what I found when I got there, and for the incredible complexity of the country, the incredible, I don't know, contradictory things that people were experiencing in the wake of a kind of transition that's kind of archetypal to a lot of societies, where you have a kind of handover of power. You have a liberation, an amazing liberation that a majority of a group of people really fought for, and then they achieved, and they then took over. So it was a little bit of a tainted gift. They took over in that liberation. They were freed into being allowed to, or being gifted to, being able to rule a society that they hadn't even liked, they hadn't even chosen, and they hadn't even built. And it was like, here, enjoy, good luck. Let's see what you're going to do with it. And so I just think the sort of way that people had grappled with that, and the way that their identities had to really, really change and shift 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, we're now almost 30 years after the beginning of Nelson Mandela's presidency, was amazing. I also felt, so I just started, I moved all around the country. I lived in various different places. I learned like one local language in full and two in half. It's got 11 languages, official languages, South Africa. And I really grappled with weather and how I wanted to write about it, which is something we can also talk more about. But I thought about, I was trained in a sense as like a long form political magazine writer / opinion columnist at the New Republic, which I loved when I was there, but had this very kind of sharp-edged, contrarian, very structured argument style. You have your argument that's very structured. And I actually wrote 3 different drafts of this book over about 10 years. And I threw away 2 of them virtually in entirety. For some different reasons, but really because they were almost like too programmatic, too kind of prescribed. So there was also a process there of me trying to learn about this country and grapple with the very unsettling parallels it had with the US. I think in terms of race and sort of the kind of way racial categorization and race consciousness was imposed and became a profound reality. It probably is the country on earth that has the most parallels with the US. That's the most comparable in that way.
Right.
And I feel like that's like, we don't study it enough given
Right.
that. You know, we
Yeah.
look at like Denmark. I've been to Denmark, like it's not very much like America, but it's like, oh, that's going to be our like touchstone, you know. And we have this country, which has so much to teach in terms of why and how people hold on to power, why and how racial attitudes persist, are created, change, etc. But as I was kind of trying to like learn that and learn these languages and travel the country, I was also trying to unlearn, I think, a little bit of the way I had been taught how to write nonfiction. So I ended up, I had the idea that I wanted to write something that was like an elegant book-like version of a music video of these cuts.
I would love to read that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. These cuts between the story I'm telling and then these scenes, these other characters. But I was doing it in kind of, I don't know, at one point, almost like a true crimey way, ways that are very, you know, telling a very tight story with some tight takeaways and nut graphs and, you know, and I ended up kind of tossing that. And I'm saying this because sometimes people have asked me, how did you find the three main characters in this book? So this book is quite a kaleidoscopic vision of that I hope is quite like visual and visceral of what this country is. But there are three main characters who really have very strong stories that are intertwined throughout that, and they're kind of leading you. And the answer is that originally I was kind of looking for archetypes. I was like, I want, you know, your certain type of like white revanchist, like, you know, just like a thing that I had in my head. And ultimately, I ended up just deciding that I needed to try to get down on paper and write about the people that I thought about the most. Not even as a writer, but just like I, the person, just kept thinking about the things they told me, kept thinking about their stories. So it's one of the last, those three are one of the last men who was drafted to fight in the apartheid army at 19, right before apartheid fell. A woman who's the exact same age, who was a very kind of strong anti-apartheid activist and fighter in a township in the 80s. And then her daughter, who was born right before the end of apartheid. And I wrote actually most of this book, and I hope that it'll read really beautifully to people. And I sometimes hesitate to like say this, but it was kind of an interesting thing for me, was that I actually wrote most of this book as a text message.
Oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, like a really long one, obviously, but to a friend of mine in Kenya, where I lived for 2 years in the middle of my time in South Africa. And he was just so interested in it because also that country has very different parallels, but has a lot of synchronicities, their history with South African. And I just found, you know, telling him directly, like, it just stripped away writerly stuff, whatever, and just like, you really, hey, you have to hear about these people. You got to hear this thing that happened. And yeah, so that's just a little bit about the book. It doesn't really totally encapsulate it, but we'll discuss it a little bit more.
It's. I just want to say.
Do you want to jump in, or do you want?
Yeah, I want to say this just briefly and just say, you know, the book is as like stunning as it is terrifying, for a lot of reasons, as a writer, but also as a writer from Mississippi. Do you know what I mean? Like, and as a young writer in Mississippi, like, we literally look to South Africa as what we could potentially, possibly, maybe be, right? And when you look and you read this book, you're gonna understand why I say it is a stunning and terrifying like creation. But I wonder if you could read like a page for us or so, so people can get a little grounding more, and then we can maybe get a little bit more textual, and
Yeah,
sum it up a
yeah,
little bit more. Also, I
yeah,
just want to say, if you have questions, y'all, throughout, please put them in the chat, or I'm sorry, in the question and answer section, and we'll try to weave them in as organically as possible.
yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to read something from quite near the end, just to give a flavor of it doesn't spoil anything, but this is kind of how the characters are depicted, and it's also just a flavor of what's in the book. And I'm reading a little bit about Malaika, who's the daughter of Dipuo, and she ends up excelling unbelievably academically. She goes to university and then starts to find herself, as she's kind of pursuing that dream, alienated from a lot of the people she grew up with who didn't have that, who don't have those opportunities. All right. Malaika believes she will give birth to a son. She sometimes talks about Mwalimu, her future son, on social media. Mama of Mwalimu, she captions selfies. In his eyes, I see the possibility of a South Africa unoccupied. It was poignant to me that while barely older than a child, Malaika already had to imagine having a child of her own in order to imagine a South Africa proceeding reliably toward justice. 25 years living in the real South Africa suggested there was no simple road there for her. The name she chose was meaningful. In Swahili, Mwalimu means teacher. To imagine a son on whom the name Mwalimu sits comfortably is to envision a world in which Black people are no longer the ones waiting for admission. It's to envision a world in which they are the gatekeepers, the wise men, the consultants flown around to tutor the others. It could feel, though, like Malaika's country was less dedicated to giving its children a future than to refurbishing its adults' pasts. Sometimes in the middle of heated debates and serious problems in the country, Malaika confessed on Facebook, I will be wrapped in Chirititzo's arms, laughing and talking about sweet nothings. So often pleasure still felt like betrayal. But the truth is, she went on, I'm tired. Being Black is an exhausting existence. We spend our entire lives fighting. We fight to keep our natural hair. We fight to get into universities. And when we do, we fight financial exclusions and institutional racism. And as if this is not debilitating and exhausting enough, we fight a Black government that is committed to protecting and maintaining a system that oppresses us. Sometimes I just want to be with the man I love. Sometimes I just want to be happy. I'm so tired. I have been tired for years. One evening, washing out dishes after dinner, Malaika shattered a glass. It hadn't been a bad day otherwise, but something snapped and she started to weep. Then she cried harder to realize how trivial an event this was compared to the suffering of her jobless friends back in Soweto. And then her mother's voice came into her head, as clear as if she were standing right next to her. Malaika, Dipuo said firmly, take an axe and break everything.
That's good. I feel like you know that's good too. I feel like you know that's good. Let's
like to read.
Let's jump into it. So, you know, we talked a bit over email about some of the things we want to talk about, and I was thinking I've never heard a white writer have to justify why they went to Europe, right? Ever, right? To work. And it's paradoxical. So I'm wondering though, if you have, and how often you have to justify why you went to South Africa. And the paradoxical part is, do you feel like you should have to justify why you chose to go to South Africa? So I'm asking two questions at once. Like, do you feel like you have to justify going to South Africa in ways that white writers who go to Europe never have to? And do you feel like you should have to justify choosing South Africa?
That's a great question. I mean, the answer to the first is yes. I was just thinking, the other day, like, do people get asked why they moved to Paris?
Right.
No, like,
No.
you assume that's cool. Like,
Right.
right. And yet, you know, it's just as vibrant a place.
Right.
So I do get asked that. Less maybe why I went there than why I wrote about it.
Mhm.
And sometimes I get that more here, I have to say, than I
Mhm.
get it in South Africa.
Mhm.
And sometimes I'll get here, you know, why did you write about? I was encouraged to write a book only about white South Africans,
I bet you were.
which
Right.
which a
Is
the
not.
amount written on them is far in excess of their demographic,
Right.
you know, and b the country was so racialized because of apartheid, and that became so much part of the consciousness. You can't understand white South Africans without understanding the whole country, without understanding Black people, because Black people, even white South Africans who never, ever, ever interact with one Black person, you know, other than a maid, which there still are those people. There's like an archetype that lives in their head. And I've seen writers, you know, and Black people live in their head, if I can put it that way, like
Mhm.
in a threatening them or talking to them, or kind of that, you know,
Mhm.
it's a kind of figure that exists for them. And I've seen a lot of writers who will write only about, like, let's say only about the Afrikaners, only about white South
Right.
Africans. They end up taking that imagination, that imagined sort of depiction of Black South Africa, of the Black government, of whatever, as the reality, because that's what's said to them. So
Mhm.
I felt I didn't have any option
Right.
to do that. And the other thing I would say is, you know, there are people there. I found people really wanted to talk. They wanted, Dipuo in particular, one of the main figures in this book, really, really wanted to be seen by others. She did not have the time. She was working. She to lay down her own story in the way that she thought
Yeah.
was going. You know, if we all, if people can only tell their own stories, just one of the knock-on problems is that we lose a lot of stories of
Right.
nurses who work double shifts or whatever.
Right.
But they also felt that a lot of people overseas, I think, were using South Africa like almost for their own uses. So they would cite South
Right.
Africa as a way of saying, you know, we need to let less immigrants into France because look at what happened
Yeah.
to this place,
Right.
without really knowing the country and its complexities and its people. And people felt they really wanted to correct the record to some
Mhm.
extent. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm. And you know, and one of the things that we also talked about a bit was I mean, what I love about this book is that your writerly superpowers are so different than like the few that I have, but I want all of them. And you know, from reading you over the years, like I didn't know that you were so invested in like secondary character, right? Which I feel like really creates context. And when people talk about world building, but really secondary character and sort of like description of ecological stuff, but secondary character is what really creates like the context for me. And the interesting thing to me about this book is that there's so many characters. Like when the first time I read it, when I was like, wait, are we gonna sit with this character for the entirety of the book? Because they were so interesting, which means you allowed them to be so interesting to you. So I wonder, could you talk about how hard it was to actually decide? And I hear you what you say is like those three were the ones that you felt the most and wanted to explore the most. But what did you do with those other ones that I honestly feel also percolating and wanting more space too?
Yeah, that was really hard. I mean, at some point, yeah. I, I did kind of a hybrid. So I had thought at one point of writing, you know, a book that had like 10 or 12 main characters.
Uh-huh.
Other than maybe War and Peace, I feel like
It's hard to do that shit.
It's super hard to do that shit.
Yeah.
And that shit was doable in 1,200 pages
Right, right,
of
right.
of total mastery, right?
Yes.
But I got, I mean, one of the, actually maybe the piece of advice that I got the most was to tell the story straight, or focus, by which people meant like strip out all the other stories, and just tell these 3 stories, because I think they are really revealing and beautiful characters, all of them
Absolutely.
actually.
Yeah.
But I just ended up not being able to do that. So the book has a tapestry kind of quality, or like a party where
Right.
you're talking to main people, but you'll hear something come
Yeah.
in, and so it has these other stories that intrude in part. Sometimes I feel, like a biography of a citizen that is kind of used as a synecdoche for an entire society, whatever. It puts so much weight on that person, and also there might be a kind of a level of doubt that they're really that representative. So I wanted to get other voices in there who are agreeing or at times disagreeing. And it's honestly a cacophonous country like ours. People are, nobody has the sort of blessing of just being able to kind of sit with their story undisturbed, and sit with like how they feel about themselves and their role in the country and whether they've done their duty and what they're owed, without that being pushed against and disturbed by people that they meet or in the public square or in this very vibrant kind of Twitter space, and public square that the country has. And I really wanted to capture that. I definitely, so there's a 4th character named Elliot, who's a farmer, a Black farmer, who I toyed with maybe making like a full on, like giving him much more space. I think in the end, it was also who, depended on people's frankness. And we've talked a little bit about like what you do with it when someone's really vulnerable with you. I mean, even in an interview, I've been in interviews when I realize somebody's saying something that maybe they actually haven't thought about making public, fully thought it through, and then how what one's responsibility is. But these were 3 main people who told me, and not in an offhand way, but in a pretty deep way, some of their deepest doubts about what they had done, about whether they were really living up to their responsibilities to their country, mixed with their bitterness. I mean, I'm making it sound really dark. Occasionally people are like, this book is really dark. I think it's really bright in some way.
Yeah, it is a bright book. I mean, it's a bright book that shines a dark light on us, as you know what I'm saying, where we are. That's what I don't know if you would say that or not, but like I don't doubt the brightness of it and the wonder of like, I mean, we talked a bit about like what you undo in this book, and I just think you really undo 3 very kind of staunch archetypes, and you undo the way we, I think one is supposed to write about South Africa and completely. But I'm also kind of taken by this idea of like, for so many of us in the deep South, for better or worse, we've been trying to get people to use the language of reconciliation, trying to get people to use the language of debt, trying to get people to use the language of repair. And here we have a place that actually like uses that language, like operationalizes that language, and I feel like your book is just like but every page, but and there's something wonderful to me in the fact that it is like there is like this desire to always not see complexity for complexity's sake, but see folk for folk's sake who are complex, But I also wonder, as a person born in this country from the deep south, what do you think this book says and does to the country writ large, but particularly like the South, where we're from? You're from Virginia, I'm from Mississippi, two different parts of the South, but still, what do you think this book actually is saying and doing to where we are? I know that's a big question, but I just want to
Oh,
get.
when you put it that way, I do start to feel very terrified, because I make the an analogy or use the image a couple times in the book of like, imagine if your car was stolen. You had a car, and then somebody gave it back to you and told you to fly it. And now, and then there's silence because you're like, what?
Right.
This piece of shit has no wings. Like,
Right.
it's never was meant to fly. And they're like, well, that's what you're going to have to do. Like, and I think, and like, then imagine that everyone in the car was fighting and calling each other, woke libs and racist or whatever. And that's terrible. And that's like making everything extra chaotic. But then imagine that they stop fighting and they all band together and they really are like totally getting along and working together. Is this thing going to fly because of that? Like just imagine, like that thing is not going to take off the ground. Like, and that was, that's extremely visible in South Africa, where you have certain things kind of like that are familiar to us and familiar to the Southern economy, the landscape, the demographic, that are, brought to the extreme. So, they have a mining economy and an agrarian economy that basically is just built in its entirety on the idea of a certain kind of labor reserve that you're going to have, that's like pretty pliant and pretty and very low paid, and like and like those types of things. Like, nobody has to be evil and nobody has to be like Richard Spencer or Donald Trump or whatever for that to just be a source of incredible pain and limitation. And I was talking to my partner who's South African, and he was like, I just showed him a map of settlement patterns by race in the US still. And he was really shocked by the degree to which he was like, I thought there was the Great Migration. And I was like, yeah, but like, it's still like the South is still very Black, but there's still all of these sort of patterns of habitation, places that people live, ways that we are schooled, values that we have that don't really have anything to do with race directly, but that relate, but that were able to sort of be manifested because of a culture that did include racial exclusion, types of ideas around and certain ambitions and what's achievable, blah, blah, blah. And like, that is the car. And like, we now want a plane. And I think maybe that's why subconsciously I read that take an axe and break everything, because there is that feeling. And yet there's a very profound awareness that I think is under, I think a lot of the white South Africans I met expected Black South Africans to hate them, to want to take revenge on them, and to want to ruin their institutions, to want to destroy their universities, quote unquote, to want to just disrupt shit to hell. And they fundamentally do not understand the desire to be good stewards, which is human.
There's that Christo quote on where he's just almost like upset or mystified that Black folk will refuse to treat white folk the way white folk treat Black folk, right? Like, and in that refusal, there's like an anger that I think is just so I mean, that's it. Like, wait, you're mad because these folk will not do to you what y'all did to them? Um, and yet, because that Crystal character is so just, lush and complicated. What I love about the book is he does not get center stage, right? Like he shares space. And I think people are gonna want to make Christo center stage. That's what I'm really interested to see what's gonna happen with this book when people read it and talk about it. But Malaika to me is the character that's like, I'm just like, yes, fam, like you are tired of fucking having to carry this history that you really don't have much to do with, but you gotta carry it. But do you gotta carry it? But how do you fucking love and walk through the world and feel the wind and carry the weight? Okay, like that to me is so much more interesting than the uber interesting Christo. And I just think I think the decision to do that was just really, really one that I think is like just a really super sound narrative decision.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, she's also a writer, and she's writes, and so she has like this beautiful way of putting things that made it really easy to write about her. And I also spent a lot of time with her. I went back to where she was born, and that's the thing I like to do, is to go with people to, like, if they're talking about a time in their lives, even if it's
Yeah.
really minor, I'm like, take me there.
Right.
And it's funny that the Black people that I spoke to in South Africa overall, I really thought hard, like, is this true? It were much more willing to go places with me than white people who self-isolated to some degree, who just wanted the secure four walls of their offices, which they had decorated. There was paradoxically, there's so many ways in which white people are like more free, in South Africa, more privileged, richer still in South Africa, but they just did not seem to me to feel free in their space. And that was in part, that was a lot what they were imposing on themselves. And this almost like at times revenge fantasy that they needed to believe in order to feel less ashamed of their own brutality. Like they have to see some people psychologically, psychologically, they have to see an equality that basically people of, like, once they lose demographic dominance, whatever, once white people's sort of power is ebbing, that people of color will do to them what they did.
Right. Yeah.
And they have to believe it so much that they sort of see it superimposed holographically on a reality that is not that. I mean, the degree of empathy, it sometimes almost made me like cry, because I just was like, I can't believe you were treated, you went through what you went through, and you're still like, so there's a scene in the book where Dipuo and Malaika and a friend of theirs, it was in context, but I was telling them that I knew a white soldier, ex-soldier, who had been commanded but who had like been the type of person, I don't know if he did so directly, but who'd like broken their doors down at the end of apartheid, who'd beaten their children, who'd busted up their funerals with smoke bombs and ruined them, awful things. And then I said, he was effectively sort of pardoned by society for that and given a chance to kind of start over. And he started to feel really angrier than he had ever felt before, about his place in society and his victimhood or whatever. And I thought they would just be like, what a shithead. I mean, but they were like, no, we totally get that. Like totally get, like, he thought that he his people had made this country beautiful. Totally get it. Totally get how it would be really painful. It was, I think, a function of, it's nothing like magical. It's a function of having been looking from underneath, seeing the underside of others, and seeing their wholeness in a way that people in power can't do.
Right. And that particular scene was one of those scenes where I'm like, yes, I'm reading about, you know, characters and interactions and actual people colliding in South Africa, and this scene could be placed in the American South that I grew up in, and
Yeah.
wouldn't have to change no words, which is which is which is a little terrifying. You know what I mean? Like that's the terrifying part to me. But I want to ask this question, then I want to get to the questions we have until the question and answer session. I want to make sure. So one of the things you also do so well that I try to do is and I think people are gonna be surprised about this when they read this book is write about friends and friendship. And I'm
Mm.
interested in one, if you can talk about why, some of the joys of obviously like writing, rigorously about friendship, but also some of like the potential kind of blind spots and kind of like, narrative sort of catastrophes that can happen when writing about friendship too. Could you talk about that and as it relates to this book?
Oh man, I'm so curious how you do this. I'm so like fascinated. So, I mean, just theme. You write amazing things about the people that you love and kids you grew up with, and like I'm always I'm amazed at the rigor, which is actually part of love. But that
Absolutely.
you don't put them necessarily in like a
Right.
shimmering halo and like I'm so grateful for everything that Alan gave me, whatever it is. Like,
Right.
I mean, it's a
Right.
frank like, and you speculate. I mean, it's one of the things I try to take from your writing. Like you free yourself in the way that everybody does. But
Right.
writers, I think sometimes, or journalists, like feel like maybe maybe they're not allowed to. Like you speculate um, on what people really meant, on what they might
Yeah.
have really
Yeah.
been thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I I witness my friends, and I hope that's one thing that makes the friends of mine who love me and who I'm so grateful for really amazing friends of mine, because they don't just mirror me in the way that I expect. They sort of witness me.
Mm.
I try to do that. I also try to write about not just like a beat, but just what is really like troubling me in
Right.
in life. Like I try to
Yeah.
wake up and think like, what is the thing that I'm wrestling with myself. But I have had once or twice, it's not with this, but with articles, like a friend would like call me, be like, yo, like, was that me?
Right, right, right.
I'm
Right.
like,
Yeah.
oh, like, um,
Yeah.
and yeah, and I write a lot about, you know, when you're sitting at like a party or something, or like you're even, and like somebody, and there's a conversation that starts, and you're like, and and you're having something different that's happening in your own head than like, it's just, it's
Right.
like really,
Right.
and
Right.
I always kind of log that stuff, and I South Africa is a very open country. People speak quite openly. My father lives in the former Soviet Union. There's a way that's quite ingrained to be quite careful about what you say there. That South Africa is very, very, it's very frank. Um, and yet it also, like here, there's stuff that you quote can't say or don't
Right.
say,
Right.
um, or you only say with certain people, or you only, it's like that terror of like sending maybe the wrong text, like
Right.
where, um, because it's not in the right like circle.
Yeah.
And but to like really, I don't know, to capture a place that I got to know over 10 years, that I came to love. I had people who
Yeah.
loved me. My partner's South African. Like I ended up feeling like I had to recount effectively like things that I'd overheard at dinner
Yeah.
parties,
Right.
or things that people I knew had done or
Right.
said. And I anonymized them mostly. You didn't seem
Sure.
to, because
Right.
I wasn't like, I don't
Oh
want
no, I did. I
to.
mean,
Okay.
but that's the interesting thing is like very few of my friends wanted to be anonymous because historically the
Mm,
book was something that we were written out of. So even if,
I
like, you know
see.
me,
Huh.
even
Yeah.
even if it's some shit that they would never want put on TV or blah blah blah, if like if they can see that in a book, it's just like there's like that majesty of recognition with certain people. And a lot of my friends got
Hmm.
that. So that helps me a lot. Like but so sometimes they're really like, yo, put my name in that shit, and then then your publisher's like, you cannot put their name in the
Yeah,
fucking
yeah,
book. They're gonna get sued. But there's some heavy questions in there. I want to get to. Here's
yeah,
one right here that I wanted us to talk about, but anonymous attendee is gonna bring it to us first.
yeah.
As an American author writing in and about South Africa, did you imagine your audience is more of an American one or a South African one or both? Did anything about that imagined audience change what you wrote or how you hoped it would be received? That's interesting, given what you said about the text messages. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say that I imagined, I wrestled with that, whether who I was writing it for. Um, it, and I don't think you always know. And I think sometimes it can turn out different than you think. But like, so I imagined the audience as not South African,
Yeah.
not necessarily American, but not South African, and wanting that vision into that said. So the book just comes out today. I don't I don't know exactly like who's gonna read it yet, but the people that I gave early copies to, some of the people who, a few of the people who loved it the most were South African, and they
Mhm.
were like, "Hey, I just loved reading these type of like human stories at length."
Right.
Um, and that there were maybe things that because everyone was so partitioned off from aspects of their own
Right.
history, or the sort of society and the government tried to, and so people from various communities were like, yo, like, or wow, I didn't know, like on this page I learned something that I
Uh-huh.
had never known about South African
Mhm.
history. So
Mhm.
but I did imagine originally the audience to be not South African.
And I think this question is sort of tied. This person says, "Hi Eve, thanks for your insight. Halfway through, and I have to say, I love your prose and storytelling. One of the most striking parts to me was the Africaneer fellow with the second for show or escape, home in a trailer. Is that kind of self myth making and role playing all that familiar there?"
Yeah, so this person is talking about one of the first like Afrikaner friends that I met in South Africa, and he brought me to his house, like to check out his house, and it was like a trailer with like a lot of I don't know, like old naked mannequins, and like
Right.
I don't know, like an outdoor toilet, like just stuff like that. And I didn't learn for a while that he didn't live there. Most that was
Right.
like a weekend getaway, and he had like an urban apartment.
Right.
And so, but he wanted me, he explicitly said like, I'm a poor white. um and yeah, like it didn't, that was, I mean, I told that story because that was I was pretty taken aback when I learned that he had a nice apartment. But he like brought me home to his
Right.
shack effectively.
Right.
So that was like pretty extreme case, but yeah, I would say there's um a I mean, one thing is it's gonna say, there's a lot of white South Africans who don't wear shoes even in the mall, or like at a gas station, or like at a dinner party, but like a nice one. And like it's this kind of like down home, like, but it's like they'll be wearing like really nice clothes. It's funny because it's like a kind of whacked out version of like something that's maybe a little familiar, like to me.
Right.
Like,
I was
yeah.
about to say I've seen such things.
Yeah, I mean, I told a story in the book very briefly of like um it doesn't make anybody look great, but like people I grew up with. I was going on vacation and like
Oh
were
yeah.
quite upper middle class, and got a kind of, and we were going to West Virginia, like to because from Virginia, and we got lost legitimately at night in a trailer park, and I had this weird, it was just one of these things when you're really young and you're like, it sticks with you because you don't quite understand it yet, but you understand that there's something like key here that's like contradictory or psychological. But I was like, why are these people so kind of excited
Right.
at part halfway to like be? So it's a variety of sort of
Yeah.
slumming,
Yeah.
so to speak, of we're down home, uneducated.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then this question is an interesting question. Because I have no idea how you're gonna come at it, but and it's a pretty basic question, but so this question is, what was the most surprising about South Africa? And after reading that book, I wonder, can I ask you what you think of that question before you answer that question? What was the most surprising thing about South Africa? Because I guess you're gonna get that question like a lot for the next few months, maybe. But what do you think
Oh
about
yeah, I mean, I will like. I guess like would people who live in America ask themselves like, what's the most surprising thing about America? Like I'm not like I can give answers to that. I
Of
mean,
course,
it's a
yeah.
question that maybe you ask someone who goes to like uh Micronesia for 3 weeks or something. Like, it's maybe a tourist question, and you got, I do live there really effectively by now. I speak
Right.
local languages, so like
Because
there's
really,
a
that's what that question is about, right? I feel like that question is really asking you, are you a tourist? I mean, are you a tourist in South Africa? Like, you know what I mean? I feel like the roots of that question, but I don't know.
I still get, I mean, I still have debates with people about, I'm in this weird position now where like, just by dint of how much research I did, I may know more details of South African history than some South Africans.
Mhm.
However, some of the questions are personal for them in a way that my partner and I joke that like the emotionality, that my sort of emotionalism about American politics is sort of like, he watches a ton of like your American political shows and reads a
Right.
ton about American politics. And I watch and read much more about current South African politics. And at one point we were like, why is this? And we're like, not like, it's too close to
Yeah.
home.
Too close. Right.
Like, so you update me, I'll update you. And you
Yeah.
tell me
I
like
feel
something
that.
that I really need to know.
I feel that.
I mean, I can say like, something that surprises me always is like how much, I mean, South Africa is not only the most economically unequal country on earth, it is by far,
Mm-hmm.
it is like way more, like it's in its own league.
Yeah.
And the grace and the kind of honor with which a huge range of South Africans from all sort of race groups, as they're called there, quote unquote, or walks of life, are kind of living this situation, when on paper, like if you were to say, okay, this is a science experiment and here are the like inputs or whatever, like here's the chemicals that we're putting into this vial, like it should explode or it should just not function.
Mm-hmm.
That's also heavy because like people should not have to
Right.
walk under this load.
Absolutely. Right.
And so that's, and yet I find something, I know that people are doing it in some cases because they have to, but in other
Yeah.
cases, I know that people are choosing to do it because they feel like they have a duty to their country and a responsibility to what they fought for,
Absolutely.
to hope, to and I find that honorable. I mean, I find it remarkable. So
Now people coming with these bomb questions. Let's try to get. We got 2 minutes, so let's try to get.
okay.
I mean, one by the great Garnet Cottigan. So, thanks for this delightful conversation. If time permits, I'd love to hear Eve's reflections on what it means to find the balance between her voice and the voice of the various characters in the book. Simply put, how do you honor the voices of the various people in your story while trying to carve out a distinct voice that is indelibly yours? Great question.
Great question. I do a ton of direct quoting. And I also do a thing that I was recently told is called free and direct voice, which is, one can have a long conversation about that, but it's basically around the quotes, not only saying, distancing yourself and saying, as Kiese was like sitting across from me, he sighed and he said this and quoting, but putting the reader in almost like they're being piloted around behind your eyeballs. And I've really tried to do that. And I'll be really interested in what people think when they read the book of, what that does for it or doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, the point of view usage and the shifts are like something we could talk about for like days. All right, and then last one if we can. This is because this is really important. The blurb for your event invites me to hear about how the South African events sometimes foreshadow U.S. changes. Given the retrogression in U.S. society in the last decade, give us a specific example of the way South Africa and changes there are foreshadowing what may happen here in this country. Could you? I'm just going to ask that as a question.
Yeah, I'll give two quick thoughts. They can both use unpacking, but hope they're unpacked in the book to some.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's right.
So the first I would say is I don't even know that I talk about it. There are people who talk about or through whom I explore the reality that I saw there that I felt really was striking. Just saw over and over that it can become harder for like a historically in charge group of people or historically dominant, however you want to put it. That's not pejorative, but it can become harder to and more painful to complicate or negatively assess or reassess one's own history as that history recedes. And that was pretty paradoxical. And I think, we can see a little bit of that of like, it just becomes heavier. And I really try to say at more length why, but and in the book. So I hope you'll read it. But the other thing, and I think this is done currently more in like private spaces in America, but I don't think that we have yet. We don't have a Congress that is majority women or majority people of color, or most elite old institutions. I don't think the masthead of the New York Times is majority women and whatever, people of color, maybe, but I don't think so. And so, but they are in South Africa. The newspapers are, the parliament is.
Right.
And that moment at which that occurs is a huge one, because it is a real profound moment of reckoning of like, okay, now we're in, we really are in. Like, it's not, the fight isn't about being in or even necessarily being seen as much. It's as much anymore. But like, what the fuck is this place like
Right.
that we're in? Like it, and you know, you would think that, and this is something that a particular government official in South Africa talked to me at length about in a way I thought that was really profound. But it was like, you would have thought that we would have like foreseen, you know, how this tension between, was the goal of our struggle to dismantle the system, or was the goal to be able to move more freely within it?
Ooh.
But we did not really, you know, the struggle was so legitimately burdensome that like there wasn't a whole lot of time to really like think about that. And that question, you know, was the point of our struggle to dismantle the system or to move more freely within it. You have to have a degree of power already to ask yourself that. Yeah. And I think that that's still coming, probably.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this book, and thank Nick, and we want to thank Powell for being incredible. And thank y'all. And if you haven't already gotten the Inheritors, you know, I don't know what you're waiting on. You should go on and get it. You can go on, you just go on, fly to Portland, or just go on and get it from the website. Either way, but thank you, Eve, so much for giving us so much in the book, and also giving us so much in this conversation. This was really an incredible time for me. I appreciate it.
This was really great. Yeah, it was really great to talk to you in particular. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you both so much for joining us. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for, you know, all the talk about the books and all that, and, you know, getting to know you both. So please go get a copy of The Inheritors. Check it out. I put a link on the in the chat there. Check it out on pals.com. While you're there, check out our upcoming events. We got all kinds of cool stuff, live and virtual events just like this in the upcoming weeks and months and all that. So also, yeah, and also check out Kiese's books. One of his books.
Yeah.
And check out some green hair. You know, we checking out everything. We like to check out the green hair.
The moss hair, yes.
Yeah.
I think it might now be beer time finally. Yeah.
Right.
Yes, it's beer time. Go have a beer. Yes. So, and thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for today. Once again, thank you both.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Have a good night.